Mistakes that people make when they're just starting out with bonsai is you start with a plant that is too small. I get it, yes. You go to a YouTube channel just like mine, for instance, where I show that you have a nice, happy, healthy juniper, and then you can take cuttings. You have the wrong idea on how a bonsai is grown. Do you think that a bonsai is grown by taking a small plant like this and then just slowly over time letting it grow out into a specimen like that? And you think a bonsai needs to be in a small pot straight away. What does it mean when you put a tree that you just purchased into a small bonsai pot and you then think, I'm going to develop the tree in there? There's one mistake that many beginners make when they're starting off with bonsai, and this is it. Hey, welcome, this is Jelle growing bonsai. If you're just starting out with bonsai, one of the things everybody knows, a bonsai is a tree in a pot. Actually, it is a funky tree in a cool pot. So what do? You go out to a garden center and you get yourself a nice tree. You went to a garden center and you didn't go for a tiny little plant, no, you went for a big plant. This is a nice katsura. It was in the sales section of the garden center. You come home and you've got a nice pot, you've got a nice tree, you got scissors, let's get started. Or maybe not. So, mistakes that people make when they're just starting out with bonsai is you start with a plant that is too small. You have the wrong idea on how a bonsai is grown. And you think a bonsai needs to be in a small pot. So beginners often get trees that are too small. And look, I get it, yes. You go to a YouTube channel just like mine, for instance, where I show that you have a nice, happy, healthy juniper, and then you can take cuttings. If you remove the bottom leaves and you then chuck it into substrate, you can grow that out. And you get plants like this, right? And you can shape them, you can wire them, you can position them, and then you have a start of a bonsai. Reality is that between this one and this one, there might be 6 years. And to get to this one, you can add another maybe 10, 15 years. So this one is probably 15 to 20 years old. This one is only 3 years old. This one's probably 6, 7 years old. And this is 5 minutes old, right? So if you want to have a tree with a big fat trunk, count on a decade to get a big fat trunk when you're starting off with, where is it? This little cutting. Let's in fact check that in here. You never know. So yeah, I am partially guilty to people buying too small trees. So if you go to a garden center, you need to look for a tree that is so big that it has the trunk that you want. Ideally with a bit of movement, because really trunk thicker than this, don't try to bend it unless you really have to. Better get material that already has a nice twisted trunk, or be willing to wait for a couple of years to grow out a trunk. And that brings me to the second mistake that people that are just starting out with bonsai often make. Do you think that a bonsai is grown by taking a small plant like this, planting it in a bonsai container? This is actually way too big for this tree. And then just slowly over time letting it grow out into a specimen like that. If that is what you're thinking, then you're mistaken, because there's a phase in between. And that is basically the beefing up of the trunk. A trunk like this does not appear in a pot. It will take decades of ground growing or growing in a very big pot before you have a trunk like this. So what happens is that you take a young plant, you let it grow out as a long whip. During the process you wire it out. Look, there's a nice little shape to this one already. And once you have the trunk line that you want, you plant it in a big pot or in the full ground, and you just let it grow a big bush and then cut it back. That is what you can see here. This is where the tree has been cut back. This was maybe 3, 4, 5 meters long when this was cut back. In fact, there is a rule of thumb that every centimeter of thickness of the trunk, and a centimeter that is 2/5 of an inch, every 2/5 of an inch is 1 meter of extension, is 3 feet of extension. So you can imagine here I've got 2 inches, 5 centimeters, 5 times 3 feet, 15 feet, 5 meters. The branch here would have been 5 meters before it was cut back. Now of course it doesn't have to be one cutback. There's a cutback here, there's a cutback there, there's a branch missing here, there's a branch missing there, there's a branch missing there, there's a branch missing there. This was a huge shrub before it was reduced to become a bonsai. So no, a small tree in a small pot does not become a big bonsai in a big pot. That's number 2. Now number 3 relates to this actually. If you go to the garden center, you get yourself a nice plant. The first thing you do is not repot it into a bonsai container. And of course I get it. Having your tree in a nice pot makes all the difference. This looks so much better than the same tree in a big plastic tub. But if you just get a tree from a garden center, there's a few things that you first need to do. First, you need to work on the roots. The roots from a tree that come from a garden center typically just grow down rather than out. And for a nice bonsai, we want a nice nabari. This is a plant from a garden. It doesn't really have a nice nabari. You see an ugly root here, there's a root there, there's no roots here, there's no roots here. So that's not very pretty for this tree, right? So that's what you can work on if you get a tree from a garden center. You, in the first moment for repotting, which typically is in early spring, you remove the vertical roots and you plant it with the horizontal roots outwards in a shallow but wide container. Then you let it grow for a year, it is established, and then you chop it back. Remember what I said about the juniper, the long branches? That's the same thing that you'll have to do with your garden center tree. So this tree, even though it is nice and tall, it doesn't have a fat trunk, it probably doesn't have a nice nabari. Next year, first I'm going to clean out this root ball, plant it up in a very, very shallow container. Typically a pot like this. This will stimulate wide growing roots and will hold back the vertical roots. Now once you've done that and it has established, after a year or so, you can then decide to cut it back. You look for a nice trunk line. Here at the bottom you see that the trunk comes out of the ground in a vertical fashion and it continues, but there's a side branch that comes out and this has a little bit of a swing. So this I could use as a new extension from the main trunk. This I'm going to take off. I might air layer it and have a new plant, but I now have movement in the trunk. Especially if I bring this one over to that direction, you have a nice movement. But you can imagine, for this to become a bonsai, there's going to be a lot of growing. In fact, I want the tree trunk to be a lot fatter first. So I might actually leave it for 5 or 6 years in a very flat, shallow container to just grow out, develop the bulk. Potting it in a small, nice pot is going to be maybe 6, 7, 8 years in the future. That's when this pot will be suitable for this tree. Now, what does a bonsai pot do? To me, a bonsai pot is a similar thing like a frame on the picture. If you buy a nice painting, it has a nice frame. The frame, you don't see it, it's there, but you don't notice it when you look at the painting. Yet without it, it will look very, very ugly. It's an unfinished painting. But when do you put a frame on? Exactly, when you're done painting. Once the paint is dry, just put a nice piece of varnish over it, it's nice protected, and then you put it in a frame at the point that you say, I think this now looks really, really great. Same with bonsai. Actually not completely the same with bonsai, because the bonsai is never finished. But you put it in a nice bonsai pot once you have the primary and secondary branches set. Now what are primary and secondary branches? If you look at a tree here, the first branch that comes off the trunk is the primary branch. Then every branch that comes off that primary branch is a secondary branch. And from there you go into your tertiary branching. Tertiary branching is actually that shape of the tree. This is what fills out the canopy. The primary and the secondary are the hand that holds up the foliage, you could say. So once you have your main structure of your tree ready, so the trunk is grown, the chops have healed, this will never heal, your primary branch is set, your secondary branches are set, and you're starting to work on your tertiary branches, that is when a bonsai pot starts to really, really be useful. This is a little awkward. I now need to jump in and correct myself, because as I'm editing the video material, I realized that I might be giving off the wrong impression. Of course, you can grow a bonsai out in a bonsai pot. It is just a very slow process. Now, if you look at this tree was styled 5 years ago for the first time. I'll pop up a picture and you'll see how thin the trunk was at that time. It has developed considerably over the last 5 years. But had I planted this in the full ground, the trunk probably would have doubled in size compared to what it has done now. So yes, you can grow out a bonsai in a pot, but if you want extreme trunk development, strong taper, rapid response, growing in the ground, growing it in full ground is a lot faster than growing it in a pot. So what people often do, they take a middle ground. They take a very big pot and let it grow out in there, and then you put it in a small bonsai pot. It just takes a lot longer. Look at this tree. This is an arakawa Japanese maple, and I happen to know who owned it before me because I bought it off him. And this tree has been in his possession for 30 years. 30 years ago, he bought an arakawa something of this size. He planted it in a bonsai container and grew it in this, well, not in this, but in a bonsai container all that time. However, if you now look at the size of this trunk, it is only 3 or 4 inches thick. That is not a massive trunk for the age of the plant. If you would have planted this in the ground and you let it grow for 5, 6, maybe 7 years, then a trunk this size would also have appeared. Of course, the branches would not have all of the bark all the way till the end, because the barking over only happens after a couple of years, but growing it in a pot is certainly possible. It just takes a lot more time. And this is an example of a plant that is growing out. It is not in its final pot. The pot is considerably larger than the bonsai pot it will eventually be in. And you see that I get quite good extension growth on here. And this is something that I'm growing from seed in a pot over the full course of its life. As a result, the nabari is developing very nicely. I can keep good control over it, but the trunk fattening isn't all that fast. I think this is also 4 or 5 years now that I've been growing it from seed. Because besides it being a frame of your tree, it also has a function. By constricting the roots, you don't give the roots all that much space. The tree is signaled, hey, I'm at the end of the resources available for me. And therefore, the growth will be slower, it will be more compact, and the leaves will show. And the leaves will naturally become smaller and smaller by itself. You can still water a lot, you can still fertilize a lot, but the growth will be slower and more compact. So that is actually the main function of a bonsai pot, is to make sure the tree uses its natural mechanism to become miniature. So 3 mistakes that people starting off with bonsai often make. First of all, when you buy a tree that's too small for your ambitions. Second, people think a small bonsai becomes a big bonsai. Third, you put a tree in a bonsai pot even though it's not ready. So knowing what the bonsai pot really does for the growth pattern of your tree. What does it mean when you put a tree that you just purchased into a small bonsai pot and you then think, I'm going to develop the tree in there? Exactly, you're going to get very, very little growth. And that's not the idea of development stage. When you're developing your tree, you want lots of growth. And that's actually the hidden number 4 of mistakes that people make. A bonsai tree, especially in development, needs to grow lots and lots and lots and lots. Let these branches grow, let them shoot out, let the tree grow wild, and prune it back during the season or at the end of the season. That way you bulk up the tree, the trunk gets fatter, the branches get more heavy, there's more energy. When you do root prunes, the roots respond quite well, and you don't really risk the health of the tree. If you, however, constantly keep your trees pruned, pruning back every single growing tip as soon as it appears, you're going to weaken your tree. Hidden tip number 4, don't prune your tree all that much. Let it grow wild every once in a while. I hope this is helpful. Thank you for watching.